What do you do when you're being hunted by a ghost? A predator so perfectly evolved for its environment that it feels supernatural. What if this ghost could dance in the air, turn on a dime, and kill you before your mind could even process the threat? For the first American fighter pilots of World War II, this wasn't a nightmare. It was a terrifying reality. A reality that came in the form of a fighter plane called the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. This is not just a story about machines of war. It's a story of intellectual courage, of how desperate men, outmatched and outmaneuvered, learned to weaponize physics, psychology, and the one control in their cockpit nobody ever thought of as a weapon: the throttle. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're climbing into the cockpit to uncover one of the most incredible tactical revolutions in military history. We'll explore how American pilots went from being prey to being the apex predators of the Pacific sky, and how a simple act of throttling down in combat became the move that made the invincible Zero overshoot every single time. The first few months of 1942 were a time of shock and disbelief for the Allies in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was a smoldering ruin, and the Empire of Japan was advancing like a tidal wave. But for the American pilots tasked with stemming that tide, the true shock came not from the grand strategy, but from the brutal one-on-one reality of air combat. The stories they brought back from the edge of death sounded like fishermen's tales of a phantom fighter that defied the laws of physics. They described an enemy aircraft that could turn inside anything the United States Navy or Army Air Forces could put in the sky. It could climb like a homesick angel and move with a grace that was as beautiful as it was lethal. This was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, and it wasn't just good. It was terrifyingly, mythically good. Imagine you're a young American pilot in a Grumman F4F Wildcat. Your aircraft is a beast, nicknamed the Grumman Iron Works. It's rugged, heavily armed with 6.5 caliber machine guns, and can take a ridiculous amount of punishment. It feels like a flying tractor, solid, dependable, powerful. Then on the horizon, you spot the Zeros. They are sleek, almost delicate, painted in a pale, ghostly white. You dive to attack, the roar of your Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp engine filling the cockpit. You get a burst of gunfire off, tracers slicing through the vast blue emptiness. And then the Zero turns. The numbers tell a story of life and death, measured in seconds. At combat speeds, the Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in a blistering 16 seconds. Your Wildcat needed around 19 seconds. The Army's P-40 Warhawk, even longer. 3 seconds. It sounds like nothing, but in a turning dogfight, 3 seconds is an eternity. It was the time the Zero pilot needed to complete his turn, acquire a firing solution, and stitch a line of explosive 20mm cannon shells from your tail right into your cockpit. This turning magic wasn't magic at all. It was the result of a radical, almost heretical design philosophy. Japanese engineers, led by the brilliant Jiro Horikoshi, built an aircraft that weighed just 5,300 pounds empty. That's roughly 2/3 the weight of a Wildcat. This incredible weight savings was achieved by stripping away everything that didn't contribute to pure performance. There was no armor plate behind the pilot seat. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb a bullet and prevent a catastrophic fire. The Zero was essentially a powerful engine and 2 cannons wrapped in the thinnest possible layer of duralumin. It traded survivability for pure, unadulterated maneuverability. One good burst from a 50 cal could turn a Zero into a funeral pyre. The problem was, you had to hit it first. The crisis facing American naval aviation was profound. The entire doctrine of fighter combat, developed over years, had been invalidated in weeks. They were teaching their pilots to dogfight, to turn and burn, to stay in the fight. Against the Zero, they were teaching them to die. As Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach would grimly state, they're trying to fight by the rules, and the rules don't work anymore. This Zero problem threatened the entire strategic picture. If the fighters couldn't win, the bombers they were protecting would be slaughtered, and America's ability to strike back would evaporate. But in the midst of the chaos and death, a few pilots who survived started to notice things. Small inconsistencies in the Zero's seemingly perfect performance. They began to think differently, and that thinking would change the course of the air war. In the tense, claustrophobic ready rooms of the USS Lexington in early 1942, one man was losing sleep over this problem. Commander John Smith Thach, known to everyone as Jimmy, was the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3. He felt the weight of every pilot he lost. Thach was not a typical squadron commander. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a student of aerial warfare, a tactician who saw combat as a geometry problem to be solved. While others focused on gunnery practice, Thach spent his nights surrounded by after-action reports, debriefing shaken pilots, and scratching calculations on notepads. He saw the pattern. The Japanese pilots knew their aircraft was superior, and this knowledge had bred a specific kind of confidence, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They would latch on to a target and commit completely to the turn, accepting high G forces, certain their opponent would falter first. This confidence, Thach realized, made them predictable, and predictability in warfare is a vulnerability. He also noticed odd details in the debriefings. Pilots who had made desperate, unorthodox moves, a sudden dive, an aggressive throttle cut, reported that the Zero pilots sometimes seemed momentarily confused. They were used to a script, and when an American pilot went off script, they hesitated. These were fleeting moments, but they were a crack in the armor of invincibility. The real breakthrough came after Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare's legendary flight on February 20th, 1942. O'Hare single-handedly attacked 9 Japanese bombers, shooting down 5 to save the Lexington. But what intrigued Thach was how O'Hare dealt with the escorting Zeros. O'Hare refused to play their game. He made high-speed slashing attacks, boom and zoom, and then used his Wildcat's superior diving speed to escape, converting that speed back into altitude to attack again. He never, ever let them pull him into a turning fight. This sparked an idea in Thach's mind. He went to his cabin and, using matchsticks on his desk, began to simulate dogfights. The problem was always isolation. A single Wildcat against a single Zero was a death sentence. But what if you weren't alone? What if your wingman wasn't just for support, but was your primary weapon? He pushed the matchsticks in crisscrossing patterns. A Zero pursuing one Wildcat would fly directly into the guns of the other. The geometry was brutally simple, but executing it at a combined speed of 500 miles per hour required a level of coordination and trust that was almost telepathic. He called it the beam defense position. History would remember it as the Thach Weave. The concept was revolutionary because it violated every instinct a fighter pilot had. You were taught to turn away from a threat on your tail. Thach was now telling his pilots to turn towards the threat and towards their wingman. It was a high-speed, head-on game of chicken, where the enemy was caught in the middle. The sheer intellectual leap Thach made here is incredible, transforming a weakness into a strength through pure tactical genius.
If you find this kind of deep dive into military innovation and history as fascinating as I do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You're supporting hundreds of hours of research that goes into bringing these stories to light. Thach drilled his pilots relentlessly. 2 Wildcats would take off and practice the scissoring motion over and over. Turn in, pass, turn out, pass again. Get the timing wrong by a fraction of a second and the 2 Wildcats would collide. Hesitate and the weave would collapse, leaving both pilots vulnerable. They practiced until it was muscle memory.
On June 4th, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, theory met its ultimate test. Thach led his division of 6 Wildcats to escort torpedo bombers. Suddenly, the sky was filled with zeros. Thach saw his wingman, Ensign Ram Dib, get a 0 on his tail. "Weave," he yelled over the radio. Thach turned his plane hard towards Dib. The 0 pilot, fixated on his prey, followed Dib into the turn with the same predictable aggression Thach had counted on. He was so focused on the kill, he never saw Thach coming. Suddenly, the 0 pilot found himself flying directly into the path of Thach's 6.5 caliber machine guns. The unarmored 0 disintegrated in a flash of fire and debris. The weave had worked. In the ensuing 20 minutes, his small division used the tactic to down 3 Zeros and drive off many more, proving that teamwork and superior thinking could defeat a superior aircraft. The Thach Weave was a brilliant defensive solution, but it was still reactive. It answered the question of what to do when a 0 was already on your tail. A new generation of pilots, hardened in the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, would develop the answer to a more fundamental question. How do you fight an enemy you can't outturn on your own terms? The answer came from a simple, brutal philosophy championed by men like Major John L. Smith of Marine Fighting Squadron 223. His mantra, drummed into every pilot, was altitude is life, speed is life, turning is death. Forget dogfighting. Never under any circumstances get into a turning fight with a 0. Instead, they would weaponize the one advantage their aircraft had: weight. A loaded Wildcat was thousands of pounds heavier than a 0. In a dive, that extra mass meant the Wildcat accelerated faster and could reach terrifying speeds that would literally tear the 0's wings off. This was the birth of energy fighting as a core doctrine. Pilots learned to think of their aircraft not just as a plane, but as a reservoir of energy, existing in 2 forms: potential energy, altitude, and kinetic energy, speed. The pilot with the higher total energy controlled the entire engagement. They executed boom and zoom attacks. They would patrol at high altitude, an energy advantage held in the bank. Spotting 0s below, they would dive, screaming downwards at over 400 miles per hour. They would get one short, devastating burst of fire on a target, and then crucially, they would not turn to see if they'd hit. They would use their immense speed to zoom back up to the safety of high altitude, converting kinetic energy back into potential energy, ready to strike again. The 0s below could twist and turn in the sky all they wanted. They were maneuvering in an empty arena. As the legendary ace Joe Foss put it bluntly, the 0 wants you to turn. That's his game, so don't play it. It's about killing the enemy and going home alive. This required incredible discipline. Imagine diving thousands of feet, your target right there. You miss. Every fiber of your being screams to pull around and try again. But that one turn would bleed off all your speed, putting you right in the 0's world, slow and vulnerable. Resisting that urge was the difference between life and death.
But what happened when it all went wrong? When you lost your altitude, when your wingman was gone, and a 0 latched on to your tail? This is where the final, most desperate and counterintuitive tactic emerged. This is where pilots learned the throttle lever itself was a weapon. On April 7th, 1943, during a massive air raid on Guadalcanal, Ensign James Sweat found himself in this exact impossible situation. A 0 was glued to his 6, closing in for the kill. His Wildcat was damaged. He was out of options and out of energy. In a moment of pure inspired desperation, he did something that violated every rule of survival. He chopped his throttle to idle and popped his flaps. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The Wildcat decelerated so hard, sweat was thrown forward against his harness. The Zero pilot behind him, who had been perfectly matching his speed for a killing shot, was caught completely by surprise. His own momentum carried him rocketing past Sweat's wing. This is an overshoot. In that 1 second, the predator became the prey. Sweat slammed his throttle forward, pulled the nose up, and fired a burst into the Zero's exposed belly as it hung in the air before him. The Zero plunged into the sea. The throttle down overshoot was born. It was a mind game played with physics. A pursuing pilot needs a few fractions of a second to recognize a change, decide what to do, and physically act. In that time, at 300 miles per hour, he's already traveled hundreds of feet further than he intended. The technique was a bet. You were betting that your enemy's expectations and his momentum would betray him before he could shoot you. The guts it took to intentionally slow down while being shot at is almost unimaginable. It was the ultimate act of fighting smarter, not harder. The evolution of these tactics is a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. We spend countless hours digging up these incredible details, and by taking a second to subscribe, you ensure we can keep bringing these forgotten stories of heroism and innovation to you. It truly means the world to us. Guadalcanal's Henderson Field became the laboratory where these theories were proven in blood. Veterans like Captain Marion Carl perfected the techniques. In one engagement, with a Zero on his tail, he chopped the throttle and dropped his landing flap simultaneously, causing a dramatic deceleration. The Zero overshot so fast, it passed nearly 100 feet in front of him. Carl retracted the flaps, firewalled the throttle, and blew the enemy out of the sky.
The Japanese naval aviators were not fools. They realized American tactics had changed, but they were trapped by their own design. The Zero was a turning machine. When forced to fight high-energy battles, it was out of its element. A Zero trying to boom and zoom was mediocre. A Wildcat using energy tactics was leveraging its core strengths. By early 1943, this hard-won knowledge from the Pacific front lines was systematically brought back to the United States. Jimmy Thach himself was put in charge of redesigning the entire fighter training curriculum. New pilots were no longer just taught to fly, they were taught to think. They learned energy management using classroom physics demonstrations. They practiced the Thach Weave until it was second nature. And they ran drills on the throttle down overshoot, instructors on their tail, forcing them to build the muscle memory and nerve to pull back on the power when every instinct screamed to push it forward. The results were staggering. In the second half of 1943, as these fully trained pilots began to flood into Pacific squadrons, American fighter kill ratios climbed above 5-1, then 8-1, and kept rising. This wasn't because of a few super aces. This was the new average. The ultimate proof came on June 19, 1944. In an event that would be forever known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American carrier fighters, now primarily the new and superior F-6F Hellcat, met a massive Japanese strike. The American pilots, thoroughly indoctrinated in these tactics, maintained altitude discipline and used energy fighting. The Japanese, flying Zeros with inexperienced pilots who had received abbreviated training, were massacred. Over 2 days, the Japanese lost nearly 600 aircraft. American combat losses were less than 30. The kill ratio was astronomical. Japanese naval aviation was shattered, and it would never recover. The Zero hadn't necessarily become a bad plane, but the tactics to defeat it had become universal. The American military had become a learning organization. It analyzed a problem, developed solutions, and institutionalized that knowledge faster than our adversary could adapt. The Japanese, trapped by a rigid doctrine and a belief in their superiority, could not keep pace. The legacy of this tactical revolution echoes to this day. Energy management principles developed over Guadalcanal are still fundamental to modern air combat. The pilots of Top Gun flying supersonic jets still study the geometry and energy states of an engagement in ways Jimmy Thach would have instantly recognized. The throttle lever, once just a simple speed control, became a symbol of a larger truth. The greatest weapon in any conflict is the ability to outthink your opponent, to question assumptions, to challenge convention, and to have the intellectual courage to pull back when every instinct tells you to push forward. The Zero pilots, so confident in their superior machines, expected another easy kill. Instead, they found themselves rocketing past their target, suddenly vulnerable in the last few seconds of their lives. The throttle had spoken.
Thank you all so much for joining me on this deep dive into the tactical brilliance of the Pacific Air War. The story of how these pilots overcame such incredible odds is one that never ceases to inspire me. The questions that remain are what make history so alive. What other unconventional tactics have turned the tide of war? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing for more stories like this. Your support is what makes this all possible. We'll see you in the next one.